Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. Our aim today is that we are going to dive into one of the most frequently asked questions, but also something that is a really important decision for GPs that are thinking about making the move into Australia as a GP. Now, that's the registration process. That's comparing the RACGP PEP specialist pathway a little bit against obviously the AHPRA expedited pathway. Now, whilst obviously it is very difficult to kind of do a full comparison because both of these will allow you to obviously enter into Australia, wanted to obviously make sure we provide the information to make sure you can make the best decision for yourself. Now, my name's Thomas. I've been working in the international healthcare sector for over 5 years, kind of 6 years now. I've been assisting GPs just like you with your move into Australia. Now, on the other screen is my colleague Paige. She's a vital member of my team. Some of you may have spoken to her, and if you haven't already, I'm sure you will in the upcoming weeks and months.
Yeah, hi everyone. So, exactly as Thomas was saying, we just want to make sure that the registration process feels a little bit more manageable because it can seem like quite a daunting process. So, yeah, that's really the aim of today.
Awesome. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, understanding these pathways is crucial to working in Australia. Now, we want to obviously ensure that we're getting this right for you. As I say, it's a very important side of things. When we are comparing, as I said or at the start, there is no right or wrong. It's ultimately both systems will get you into Australia. It is just about finding the one that suits your requirements best. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a bit of an overview on these pathways. We're going to do obviously a bit of a comparison. We're going to run through some of the pros and the cons, along with providing some of the process that will be involved in completing this pathway.
Great. Well, yeah, I guess let's begin then. First of all, can you provide our listeners with a brief overview of these pathways?
Certainly can. So, as we said, there's currently now two pathways available, which is fantastic. It allows obviously GPs just like yourselves to obviously make a decision. But looking at the APRA pathway, the main benefit is that it's quicker. Okay, it's also an awful lot cheaper. We're kind of talking really kind of half the cost of the RACGP pathway. Now, the main benefit to the RACGP pathway, alternatively, is that it is a more established process. You can also gain your fellowship at the end, which is really favourable for a lot of people. Now, at the same time, obviously, looking at the APRA process, you will not gain your fellowship, but it is important for you to know that you can apply for this at a later date, and you will still gain your VR status. So
Right.
to try
Okay.
and break things down, So to try and break things down a little bit, into kind of smaller chunks. So the ICGP, well established, allows you to gain your fellowship, and obviously is a highly recognised pathway. The APRA, on the other hand, much quicker, much cheaper, and still grants you your VR status.
Oh, okay, right. So I was just about to ask Thomas, for those that don't know, what does RACGP and APRA stand for then?
Yeah, great question. So the RACGP stands for the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. What you'll find with Australia is they love to kind of throw an A in intersections, and you'll see this happen again very shortly. So where we have the RCGP in the UK, Australia put an A in, and they've got the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. Now with the APRA, that stands for the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Thank you for explaining that to us, Thomas.
Yeah, no problem. Now, there are obviously a lot of pros and kind of cons, to these pathways, as mentioned above. As we've already mentioned, got the faster process. We've got obviously the lower costs, obviously with APRA, but you wouldn't gain your fellowship. Now, as I've already mentioned, you can apply for your fellowship at a later date. That's something that you can do. It depends obviously on your circumstances, whether you're obviously you're keen to obviously gain your fellowship, but also obviously think thinking around, which pathway is going to suit you better for maybe, kind of your timelines. But as I
Okay,
say,
right.
you would gain your VR status through either pathway.
Now, Thomas, you keep on kind of referring back to these two terms, VR and fellow. So, what is a fellow GP and what is a VR GP for our listeners?
Yeah, another great question. So we'll start with VR, a VR GP. That stands for a vocationally registered GP. Now, a vocationally registered GP is something that's recognised through Medicare as meeting a very high standards of primary care. It's also the VR status that actually allows you to bill at a higher rate. Now, when we're looking obviously at a fellow GP, a fellow GP is somebody that has completed their fellowship through the RACGP. Now, it also obviously means that they've gone through additional exams or kind of assessments, through their registration, and just like obviously the VR, where it's recognized obviously as being at a very high standard. I guess the fellowship is kind of that next level for GPs. It's kind of the highest qualification, just like here in the UK, that a GP can really hold, against their name.
Okay, right. So that makes a lot more sense now. So, okay, we've kind of covered cost and we've covered the fellow and VRGP statuses. But other than cost, then, what would encourage someone to go through a certain pathway rather than the other?
Yeah, full of these good questions. So I guess when we're looking into what kind of would make somebody go through one pathway or another, a lot of it would depend on kind of like the individual's time frame, or maybe even like the personal circumstances. What I mean by this is thinking about the family. Okay, so you know what's obviously involved, obviously by way of the family side. Do we have people that are kids are at school? When do their school terms finish? Do we need to wait for the kids to finish their school term before making the move? We've got things like obviously training programs. If you're still in a training program, that training program doesn't finish for another 12 months, we probably, you know, got both options available. If it finishes obviously in, let's say kind of, 4 months, or kind of, finishes in 6 months, we could obviously got the ability of going through the APRA process. It's also thinking about prior commitments. Okay, so we know when we think about prior commitments, when do you have the ability to actually move? What are these commitments that you've got? There's also things like the logistical side of things. Thinking about property, for example, here. You know, if you go sell your house, how long is that going to take? What do we need to do to actually get your house in a position to sell? Or are you renting property? Do we have, another 2 years left on your tenancy agreement, for example? There's a lot of things obviously by the logistical side of things, and as you can tell, a lot of that kind of falls under that time frame.
Mm.
We're also thinking about, let's think about people's personal financial situation. Do we have the money actually in place for the RACGP? It's double the cost. APRA is cheaper, but then you won't gain your fellowship, but it is cheaper. Obviously, when we go through the RACGP, obviously it's a lot more expensive. Does somebody have those funds available? And maybe it does sound a little bit silly, but it's also kind of maybe thinking about the eagerness. How eager are you to make the move? Are you thinking, okay, I want to be there as soon as possible? Because if that's the case, Apple is going to get you there quicker. If we're thinking about actually, I want to wait, I'm in no kind of rush. My time frame is really maybe about 12 months, a year and a half. Fine, maybe let's look through the IOCGP. But as I say, and as you can probably tell here, a lot of it is based on personal circumstances. Happy to obviously discuss a GP's personal circumstances, with them, and try and maybe advise what's going to be best for that individual.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, Thomas. I mean, there's so much to consider, and it's very dependent, as you're saying. So, yeah, thank you for doing that. I guess the next thing that we really want to do is provide a brief step-by-step breakdown of these different pathways.
Yeah. So without giving it all away for our listeners, obviously we do provide a service that can kind of guide people through this. But through the APRA expedited pathway, to give you a bit of an outline, you'd be looking at things like the AMC. So we've got to set up with the AMC. Thinking about the EPIC, so with the ECFMG, doing ID. and certificate verifications, really just to obviously make sure that you are who you say you are. We've also got to make an application with the relevant medical board. Um, with then looking at things like the visas, and so on. So there's quite obviously a lot that's still obviously consisted, but it is quicker. There's actually less than what's required, obviously, with the RACGP. Now, with the RACGP Pet Specialist pathway, to kind of run through some of the steps, you've got obviously that AMC account, you've got obviously the Epic, ECFMG. We've got to obviously set up accounts with the RACGP and run through things like the comparability assessment, and then still move on to things like the visas and a few other little bits as we go through that.
Right, okay, so and of course, you mentioned for both pathways that there's an AMC account set up. So for those that don't know, what does the AMC stand for?
So yeah, the AMC, again, this is where the Australians like to throw something in there. It's called the Australian Medical Council.
Oh, right, is that the GMC equivalent?
It is bit of a giveaway, I suppose. Obviously, with the Australians throwing A's in places. Yeah, well, we have the GMC here in the UK. Australia again stuck an A in an Australian Medical Council.
Love it. Very simple. I guess we've kind of covered a lot of bases then. So one of the things you just mentioned a couple minutes ago is that we provide support throughout this entire process. So, out of curiosity, what support do we provide during these processes?
Yeah, great question, and I guess a lot of our listeners will be really keen to obviously hear this as well. So, I want to really kind of highlight to our listeners that we will assist you through the full process. That's not just a case of, as we say to here, talk about a registration. We will help you find a job. We will discuss, what working in Australia is like in great lengths. With you, we'll go through obviously what living in Australia is like. With you and your family. We can assist obviously with this full registration. Through the full aspect, but also looking into things like visas, and that's not where we stop. We will also go through things like the relocation. So, where are the good schools? What can we do about housing? We're trying to make sure we're giving you all that, assistance. And on top of that, I've actually created a few different guides and documents that you can utilize that are really, really helpful. They're really clear. It's kind of goes through like kind of step by steps, but also what you need to do before leaving the UK to set up life in Australia. So we can make sure we are going through all this for you, as we say.
Amazing. I'm sure that's really reassuring for a lot of our listeners to hear. And yeah, so I guess the next thing we kind of want to move on to following that is we thought it'd be beneficial to run through some of the top 4 questions that Thomas often gets asked during the registration process or, just before someone starts. So I'm going to read a few of those out and obviously Thomas just explain as we go along. So yeah, first and foremost, what about the supervision period once they're there? How does that differ between the two pathways, if at all?
Yeah, fantastic. So through either pathway, you will have a supervisor. Okay, now I just want to obviously our listeners to know that as a UK GP, when we're talking about a supervisor, I am not talking about you starting, from scratch again. I'm not talking about somebody that's going to quite literally, watch over you or kind of hold your hand. What I mean by a supervisor is that if you have any questions, you've got somebody that you can turn to. Now, this is fantastic because when you're going into a new healthcare system, which is a private healthcare system, which involves billing, it's you're gonna have questions, just like anybody would. So if you have any questions, this is somebody that you can turn to, about anything. You'll have things like your practice managers, you'll have your other GPs and specialists, and your nurses and your admin team, all surrounding you, but you'll have a dedicated individual that you can turn to, and that's for both pathways.
Oh, amazing. That's a really good support network then for our GPs. So, yeah, I guess the next question that I have to ask is what are some of the common mistakes that you found GPs make during registration? And then I guess how can they avoid them from now on?
Yeah, what are some of the most common mistakes? Wow. I guess there's a couple really. One of them would be, this is going to sound really really daft, but we'll actually be completing the wrong documents. As crazy as that sounds, this is something that people do when, especially when they're trying to go through the registration off their own back. You know, they will apply for document for a document or complete something that they didn't maybe need to do, or was just wrong. What this has then led to is that the percent that the registrations actually cost the individual more money. Um, Probably not ideal for anybody. At the same time, other common mistakes obviously is maybe not actually submitting enough information, so things having to get reviewed again and again. Have to obviously keep on going back and forth obviously with the relevant medical boards. I'm trying to think obviously what else has been common problems, or kind of maybe mistakes that people have done. um, and I think the next one would really be about the time, the timeline, thinking that something won't actually take as long as it does.
Mm.
You've got to bear in mind we're dealing with the relevant medical boards here. We're dealing with governments. They do not work at the pace that we want them to, unfortunately. Especially some of the, unfortunately, especially some of these governments. So, when we are obviously trying to get this, specific information, or we're trying to obviously get something, kind of verified, it can take weeks, sometimes even months to actually get that completed. So that's obviously probably one of the main things. And I guess where we make sure that they're going to be avoided is really utilizing the utensils that we create, and that my support and your support page. We've got these step-by-step guides. We'll build a timeline with you so that you can follow the guide, but against obviously a timeline, so we know really where we need to be doing obviously each step at. It makes it a bit more streamlined. It kind of makes things a little bit more kind of smoother for yourself. But as I say, you got our support, so we can check through anything before you submit it. I'm happy to go through that, and that's something that I offer and kind of do for probably 9 out of 10 GPs that we go through.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, great. And I guess that really, really well leads us into the next question that I have to ask. So, how long does it typically take, the registration process for each pathway?
Yeah, fantastic. So, as I mentioned at the top, at the as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, the APRA is kind of half the time of the RACGP. The RACGP is kind of working out really somewhere around about 9 to 12 months. That depends on how quickly you can get things done, but also how quickly it takes for these medical bodies and governments to get back to you. At the same time, if you are super busy with work and they take 5 weeks to come back to you, and then you take 2 weeks, 3 weeks to get the information back to them, we're prolonging the process. With APRA, it is much quicker. We are looking kind of 5, 6 months for the whole process. That's actually including the visa with both of those timeframes as well. So yeah, we're kind of looking at either 5 or 6 months against really kind of 10, 12 months.
Yeah, that's a significant difference. But I mean, as you said earlier, it's really dependent on personal experience, isn't it? So, okay,
Exactly.
great. So, our final question then is: are there any hidden costs or fees associated with these pathways?
Yeah, fantastic. Um, Through ourselves, there's no hidden costs or fees. We've built these step-by-step guides. Okay, so we've built obviously the the foundations for you to know what's going to need to be completed, and there's costs. We've put it all together for you, so what's going to cost where, and through the timeline, we also know when that cost is going to obviously occur. So no, there's no hidden costs. Obviously, utilizing our services to get this completed, and it's also worthwhile mentioning because probably a few of you are there thinking, "Blimey, how much does it cost for them to help us do this?" There's no cost, obviously, for our service. This is something that I do off my own back to try and make sure that we're making this move, as smoothly and as possible.
Great. Thank you for answering all those questions. Yeah, exactly as you said, this is to make it more manageable for people, less daunting, especially because you've been doing it for so long now, Obviously, this is a lot easier process for you than probably most people.
Yeah, thank you, Paige. But yeah, I guess obviously to kind of summarize what we've kind of said so far for our listeners, we've gone through the AHPRA and the RACGP. As I say, there are pluses and negatives to each pathway. But either way, we're here to obviously support you. We're here to guide you, whichever process it is that you decide to go through. I want to obviously, entice people to kind of reach out. When you hear this podcast, when you watch this podcast, or if you have any questions, reach out on the contact details that's provided here. I know that they're going to be provided obviously underneath. You'll have our contact telephone number. You'll have obviously our email address. As I say, please do reach out. And yeah, I also obviously want to offer our support. We can obviously provide you a personalized plan, personalized timeline. Happy to share some of our guides as well. So if you've got, you're going through this process, or you're thinking about going through this process and you want to obviously find out more, please do get in touch. As I say, or click on the link and you'll be able to obviously find out more information. But before we close off, I just really want to thank Paige obviously for joining today, but also thank all of our listeners at home, whether that's obviously listening on the podcast or obviously watching the video on YouTube. Really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Please also keep your eyes peeled for future podcasts, and if you haven't already, check out some of our old ones as well. I look forward
Amazing.
to
Thank
speaking
you
to
as
you
well,
very soon.
Thomas.
Bye everyone.